Hello everyone, welcome to the third segment in chapter 34, where we're going to be discussing or continuing our discussion with the origin and evolution of vertebrates. Right now we're going to focus on the amniotes. However, we're going to exclude the primates, even though primates are also amniotes. The primates will be the subject of the final segment. Now let's talk about amniotes. Of course, amniotes, they produce an amnion and an amniotic egg ultimately, and the egg provided some benefits to the embryo. It protected it from desiccation, and within the egg there are several different membranes which have different functions. One of the tissues that is present in the egg actually provides nutrition to the growing embryo. Okay, so let's look at the tree again. Just as a reminder, we've already discussed the echinoderms from chapter 33, which are also deuterostomes. Then we moved on to an introduction to the chordates, which included the key characteristics of chordates and the two groups Cephalochordata and the Urochordata, which include the lanceolate and the tunicates, respectively. And then there was a segment on vertebrates, which included all of those chordates which also have vertebrae, or some form of vertebrae. And we continued through that segment and ended at the amphibians, which are tetrapods. Now we're going to continue with the amniotes, which include the reptilia and the mammals, and then also the primates. However, we're not going to include the primates, which will be the subject of the next segment, the final. Let's take a look at a more detailed phylogeny, a little close-up of the amniotes. So as you can see, the amniotes, the ancestral amniote, basically diverged at some point, and that diverged into what's called now a group called the diapsids and the synapsids. And what diapsids and synapsids is really referring to is a hole behind like the eye socket area called the temporal fresta. And so the diapsids have actually two holes, and the synapsids have just one. Now, previously, the turtles were thought to diverge before the diapsids occur because many turtles do not have these holes. But more recently, some turtles have been discovered with the holes, so it appears that that some do not have the hole. Perhaps they lost that, and perhaps some of them started to evolve having the hole. There are other phylogenetic studies that have been that used other sources of information which still put the turtles within the diapsids group, and they are considered reptiles. So you can see that the diapsids diverge into two major four groups ultimately. Two of them are actually extinct. So the plesiosaurs and the ichthyosaurs, those are actually currently extinct, and they, this is a polytomy right here, so their evolutionary relationship probably isn't quite defined or known at this time. So the archosaurs include the crocodilians and a lot of extinct dinosaurs, the pterosaurs, and some of the other dinosaurs that are related to birds. So you can see that the turtles actually do not belong to the group called archosaurs, and they diverged prior to the archosaurs. So ultimately the reptiles diverged into the turtles and the lepidosaurs. And then the synapsids have one hole, referring to the same that I was referring to here with the diapsids having two. And the synapsids include all other animals from mammals all the way to primates and to modern humans, of course. So the amniotes here, as you can see, are a group of tetrapods, so they're all tetrapods, whose living members are the reptiles, so this is that group of the reptiles, and the reptiles include birds. So let's take a look at the amniotic egg. The amniotic egg has four key extraembryonic membranes. These membranes are the allantois, the chorion, the amnion, and the yolk sac. So those are the extraembryonic membranes. Now, of course, the egg has a shell which protects it from desiccation. It has an amniotic cavity with amniotic fluid. And then, of course, this is where the embryo is going to be growing. It's going to be developing. And the yolk sac includes yolk, which provides nutrients for the growing membrane. And surrounding the amniotic, this whole amnion, right, is the albumin. So that also provides some food source for the growing embryo. So the amniotic egg, of course, was a key adaptation to life on land, mainly because it keeps the embryo from drying out because they're on land, right? So there's very little water. The amniotic eggs of most reptiles and some mammals have a shell. Amniotes have other terrestrial adaptations. They have skin that is impermeable to a lot of materials, so the skin protects them from the environment. And they have an ability to use their rib cage to ventilate the lungs, so they can actually take in and expel a lot more air at one time. Now let's look at the basic phylogeny. So we've already gone through these groups here, and here we are at the reptilia. So you can see the reptiles and the mammals are sister species or sister groups. So let's look at some of the reptiles. As you can see, there are some examples shown here. So the reptiles is a huge clade which includes the tuatras, the lizards, the snakes, the turtles, the crocodilians, and the birds, and some other extinct groups, as I mentioned when we looked at the phylogeny. Some of them have scales that create a waterproof barrier, but ultimately all of them have a skin that protects them from the environment. Most of them lay eggs which are shelled, and they lay them on land. So most reptiles are ectothermic, which means that they absorb the heat from the environment, right? So externally as a main source of body heat. So they must regulate their body temperature through behavioral adaptations, like movement. Birds, on the other hand, are endothermic. So you can see that most reptiles are ectothermic, but some of them are also endothermic, which means that they are capable of maintaining their body temperature using metabolism. So let's again orient ourselves with the tree. So here we are talking about the reptile group right here. So again, most of these are going to be ectothermic, and the only ones here are the endothermic ones, and those are the birds. So let's look at each of the groups. Okay, so let's look at the lepidosaurs. The lepidosaurs divide into two major lineages. These lineages include the tuatras. The tuatras are lizard-like reptiles, however they are not lizards, and they're actually restricted to the small islands off the coast of New Zealand. The other living lineage of lepidosaurs include the squamates, which are basically the real lizards and the snakes. The squamates are the most numerous, and they're quite diverse. And on to a little bit more about snakes. Again, snakes are legless lepidosaurs, and they evolved from lizards. And if you remember when we were talking about some convergent evolution concepts, that there are some lizards that are also legless, so they're going to belong in the same group or phylogeny, however they have lost their legs. Snakes are carnivorous, and they have many adaptations to aid in their capture and consumption of prey. Some of them include chemical sensors, organs that allow them to detect heat, venom, loosely articulated jawbones so they can open up their mouths really wide and eat very large, or organisms that are a lot wider than their mouths, and elastic skin. So the turtles are also reptiles, so this is the other group. So now we'll go back to the tree in just a moment. But again, remember the reptiles diverged into the lepidosaurs and the turtles. The turtles are quite interesting. They have a box-like shell, and you're probably familiar with these, with upper and lower shields. And these upper and lower shields are fused to the vertebrae, the clavicles, and the ribs. So some turtles have adapted to different types of climates. Some of them can live in ponds and rivers, making them aquatic, and some of them can live in very dry climates of the desert. The largest turtles live in the sea, though. Many of the species of sea turtles are endangered, and there's a lot of groups trying to help revive them. So back to the tree, like I promised, as we already discussed, we discussed the lepidosaurs, and then you can see that they diverged with the turtles. And now we're going to look at the divergence of turtles with the archosaurs. So we're going to move into the archosaurs. So again, the archosaurs include the crocodilians and the birds. Okay, so we can see some examples of crocodilians. The crocodilians include the alligators and the crocodiles, and they belong to that archosaur lineage, and this dates back to the Triassic. So living crocodilians are restricted to warm regions. So we live in Florida, and you've seen alligators before, and there's actually crocodiles that live in Florida as well. So now we're going to move into the birds. So birds are also archosaurs, but almost every feature of their anatomy, and they're reptiles too, has undergone significant modification, mainly to allow this adaptation for flight. So some derived characters of birds include, of course, all of the adaptations that facilitate flight. We'll look at some more details on the next couple slides. But flight, in terms of an advantage, it enhances the hunting and scavenging ability of birds. It enhances their ability to escape from predators, and it helps them migrate, right? So they can fly very long distances and over some, large bodies of water and even mountains. So they also have wings with keratin feathers. So they have feathers that are made of keratin, and these help them fly. There are other adaptations, and some of these include the lack of a urinary bladder, females having only one ovary, small gonads, and the loss of teeth. A lot of these adaptations allow for the bird to not weigh as much, right? So it doesn't carry on a lot of weight. So it helps preserve energy so that it can fly. So if we take a look at the mechanism which allows the flight, we have the bone system right there, which is going to be homologous to a lot of the other vertebrate organisms. But if you look closely at the bone, it's not very dense. So again, this saves, in terms of energy, it saves a lot of energy because there is not as much weight to the wings. And you can see a little close-up of the feathers. So the feathers are, again, made of keratin, and you can see the shaft is made up of several barbs that run along the length of the shaft. And the shaft is hollow. Again, that allows for, it's not as dense, so it allows for less weight. And on the barbs are some barbules with hooks. So let's look at the groups of birds. So the living birds belong to the clade Neornithes. So within the Neornithes include also the Reptiles. The Reptiles are a specific group which is flightless. Also, it includes the penguins and other certain species that are also flightless. So there are many birds that do have feathers, and They may have some of the structures which might look like they're able to fly, however, they are not able to fly. So let's look at talk about some things about birds. So the bands of flight have basically rendered a general body form which helps them fly. Of course, they have wings and they have feathers. Um, but all of them have a general body structure, so you can see the wings. The wings extend far out, so it allows them to fly. They're quite strong. Their body is relatively small. Now, those with a larger body and smaller wings are those that cannot fly. But there are many other different adaptations and variations of birds. So a lot of the bird species, if you like to watch birds, you may be able to distinguish them by characters like their profile and their color, the way that they fly, their behavior, the beak shape, and the foot structure. So here we can see a specialized beak, and we have a foot and leg structure. We have a very long beak versus a very short beak. So we have some that are more adapted for feeding while they're flying, some that are adapted for perching, and some that are adapted to be able to obtain food a little bit better, being that they have long legs in this case. Yeah, flamingos. Now let's look at the mammals. So the mammals are also amniotes, but they're amniotes that have hair and they produce milk because they have mammary glands. But the mammals have many other characteristics. They also have a high metabolic rate, similar to birds. So birds take a lot of energy. They are endothermic, and mammals are all endothermic as well. Mammals have a larger brain than most of the other vertebrates, and the brain size starts even getting larger when we move into produce into the primates. And they have differentiated teeth. Let's talk about the early evolution of mammals. So mammals are synapsids. So remember that divergence between the synapsids and the diapsids. And I talked about the two holes behind with on the skull called the temporal fenestra. Well, in mammals, it's one hole that is where the temporal fenestra is. So and also there are two bones that formerly made up the jaw joint. They combined to form the mammalian inner ear. So now that mammals have more bones in the inner ear than that of. Okay, so let's take a look first at the temporal fenestra. So remember the temporal fenestra is kind of behind the eye socket. So this is the eye socket, and you can see the jaw joints here. So again, mammals are synapsids, meaning that they only have one hole where the temporal fenestra is, that makes up the temporal fenestra, as opposed to the diapsids, which have two. Okay, now let's focus on the jaw joints here. Okay, so the jaw joints are thought to, or hypothesized to, evolved to create the middle ear, or evolve the middle ear in the mammals. So as we can see, we have the middle ear is different between the reptiles and present-day mammals anyway. So in reptiles, within the middle ear, in between the eardrum and the inner ear is the stapes, so there's only one bone. The middle ear in mammals includes three bones, so the stapes is there, and it's more associated with the inner ear, but then there's the incus and the malleus. So now we have three different bones which make up the inner ear in mammals. So by the early Cretaceous, the three living lineages of mammals emerged. The first one is the Monotremes, the second one is the Marsupials, and then the third one is a much larger group called the Eutherians, and that includes the primates. So most of what we talk about in terms of Eutherians will be in the next segment. But let's take a look at the other two groups, and then introduce Eutherians, and then conclude this segment. So the monotremes include a lot of Australian type of organisms. So they're a small group which actually lay eggs. So they're mammals that still lay eggs, and this includes the platypus. So you might be familiar with the platypus. So also the echidnas. So what's interesting is that they lay eggs, and then the young they hatch, and then they feed. So they're mammals, right? But they don't have nipples. They don't have nipples, but they do have glands on their underside where their belly is. So once the young hatch, they basically feed on the hairs and ultimately the glands on their bellies. The marsupials are quite different. The marsupials, you're probably familiar with these. This includes the possums, the kangaroos, and the koalas. In the marsupials, the embryo develops within a placenta within the mother's uterus, so they do not lay eggs. But the marsupial, which is the embryo, it's born very early in its development, so it needs to still complete development before it can be on its own, and it's fully dependent on the mother still. So the marsupial is born, but then it's going to complete its development in a pouch. The pouch is called the marsupium. So sometimes the pouch is going to be in different areas. It might be towards the posterior end, or it might be, well, it is mainly towards the posterior end, and it's usually on the ventral side of the organism. So those are the marsupials. And then we have the Eutherians. The Eutherians are really the true placental animals, or they're commonly called the placental animals, even though the marsupials are a separate group and they actually have a placenta. But the Eutherians are a little bit different than the marsupials. They have a more complex placenta, for one, and their young complete their embryonic development within the uterus, and this is all joined to the mother by the placenta. Now let's look at some orders. Now we did focus mainly on the orders of the two major groups, and then of course a subgroup of the mammals include subgroup of the mammals, which belong to the same Eutherian group as the monotremes and the marsupials. We're going to focus on the primates on the next chapter, or the next segment. But I do want to point out one thing. So we went over the monotremes and the marsupials, and you can see there is quite a bit other groups, but we're not going to focus on those. We're going to just focus on the differences between the monotremes and the marsupials, and then of course the primate, which diverge quite, or differentiate quite a bit. But let's take a look at the lagomorpha. The lagomorpha include the rabbits and the pikas and the hares. Okay, so those are basically adjacent to the primates, and they are closely related to the primates along with all of these other orders. Now, let's take a view of this. So let's remind ourselves, we've covered all of these. We've already reached to the end of this tree right here, the mammals. And then you saw a little detailed tree of a little bit more differentiation within the reptiles. Now you can see the basic tree here. We have the monotremes, the marsupials, and then the Eutherians. And remember all of those orders that we saw in that table right there. Now we're going to focus on the primates. And you can see the lagomorpha, which I mentioned, the rabbits and the pika right here. Okay, so they're very closely related to the primates. All right, so the next segment will be discussing all of the primates and Eutherians in general. Thank you.